Welcome to Stress-Free IEP. You do not need to do it all alone. With your host, Frances Shefter, Principal of Shefter Law. You can get more details and catch prior episodes at www.shefterlaw.com. The Stress-Free IEP video podcast is also posted on YouTube and LinkedIn, and you can listen to episodes through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more. Now, here's the host of Stress-Free IEP, Frances Shefter.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. Today's guest is Jane Singleton with Launchpad for Life. Jane has over 12 years of experience as an educational leader and specialist in analyzing cognitive profiles, creating behavioral interventions, and coaching families and individuals through educational milestones and life transitions. She understands the complex systems within private and public educational institutions and has built academic support programs from scratch in the U.S. and abroad in independent schools. Additionally, she has developed customized training for organizations on topics such as executive functioning, growing in self-esteem and motivation, and parenting like a coach, as well as a variety of topics on neurodiversity. She is the founder and executive coach at Launchpad for Life LLC and specializes in helping clients understand their cognitive, emotional strengths and weaknesses, communicate more effectively, and build their self-awareness. She is an International Coaching Federation certified executive coach with a master's in special education from William and Mary. And she is a passionate advocate for inclusion. I mean, Jane, with all of that, I don't know if we can fit it all into a 45-minute show. Right? Thank you so much for coming on the show. I just can't wait to dive in and talk about where 12 years and all of this experience and all of this, what brought you into this area?
It's interesting. I think the early experiences we have, even all the way back in high school, can drive our ambitions later on. I would say for sure I've always loved why people tick. But I actually had a fabulous camp counselor experience. And I'm from a small town originally in Southern Virginia, and it was a camp for people with disabilities. And it was really from there that I realized we are not listening to what they have to say. And I really felt like, even though I love the program, being a teenager and being able to relate to those other teenagers, I'll never forget that camper saying to me, "Why are we listening to this baby music? I like Britney Spears." And in that moment, I was like, "You're right." And then so I started to advocate in that way. I was like, "Let's play some Britney Spears." And I just feel like it's so important to advocate for people without a voice. And kind of from there, I studied psychology. I did a capstone and really studied impacts of ADHD and the comorbid diagnoses and how that impacts behavior. And I love the complex cases that have come across my desk and helping people figure out how they can reach their full potential.
That is so awesome. It brings me back to, I was a camp counselor also with special needs kids, and my best friend in undergrad and I were one-on-ones. And there was one day we used to babysit sometimes. And there was one day we took her, one of our kids shopping, because teenagers, they like to shop, right? And so and I mean, the experience, she was wheelchair bound, she had cerebral palsy, and it was challenging, but the three of us just laughed and had so much fun shopping and trying on clothes, because guess what? Even though she was intellectually lower, she still was like a teenager and wanted to shop and stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And I love that you heard that and you heard from her, the other, because so many times we hear people say, well, they're only functioning on a 5-year-old level. And it's like, but that doesn't mean we only have to expose them to that, right?
Right. I also think too, right, there's so much more research now in terms of neuroplasticity. And I don't like when the adults that are supposed to be supporting people with disabilities have limited beliefs and limited goals for them. It's actually us. We're the ones that are holding them back. I think we should always live in a place of possibility. And I think, right, when you make measurable goals, you want them to be achieved. And I think that's important for progress, motivation, self-esteem. But we never want to ever limit someone with our own mindset, because that's their life. And I think we should always say there's a possibility, and how can we strive for things, and then how can we pivot when we need to pivot.
Yeah. And and listen to them and what their needs are, the other thing that's popping in my head is the movie Peanut Butter Falcon. I think that was the name of it. I don't know if you saw that or not, but it's about, yeah.
It's been a while, I will have to say, but yes, that was a great movie.
Yeah, it's a great movie about, like, she thought he was limited. And once he got out there with somebody that was like, no, you can do what you want to do. It was just amazing how he blossomed. So how do you help families? So I know, like, the global of executive functioning and so forth, but do you work with the adults and students with disabilities, or do you work with the family, or is it a combination? What does that look like?
I think it's a combination. I think we too quickly overlook how ecosystems and relationships and the cycles of that relationship really do impact behavioral change. So when we're learning and growing, that is still behavioral change to some extent. And so the idea here is, I think it's best practice that you, of course, I always want to start with the young adult or the student, depending what my client is, and get their perspective in an uninhibited way. Because it's really important for me to stay completely objective and think of myself as an advocate for them, and hear where they're at, understand where their self-awareness is, and then also understand the parent dynamic separately. So I often meet with them separately, and then I'll bring them together, because a huge piece of my job is being a coach and learning that training is that it's important to ask the right questions to facilitate conversation and help those family dynamics, so that communication can become more effective, but also you can hear each other's frustrations. And I think facilitating that's super important, whether that's with private clients, but also in schools. The mediation piece of it becomes hard when we're parents, right? And it tends to be kind of top down. And you see that too, business or schools, right? Is like top down leadership doesn't work. And you are a leader as a parent, and you are a leader as a mentor in a child's life. And so there's just a lot of similarities and overlap. And I think how we need to approach in growing people. We're growing people, whether they're in school or whether we manage them. And most certainly we are growing them if we are a parent or a caregiver.
Right. And that's, I'm thinking, like, in the IEP world about how, especially when the kids get older, I always, parents ask me, well, do we invite, should we bring our child to the IEP meeting? Because 14 and over, they're supposed to be starting to participate and stuff. And I always say, probably not for the whole meeting, because they're going to zone out, but for the part when we're talking about accommodations and supplementary aids, that's the part, what does your child need? What do they think is helpful? What are they using? What are they not using? What do they wish they had? What can we recommend that they didn't think about? Because we can sit there and develop an IEP, but if we don't get the teenager buying into it, it's not going to go anywhere, really. And so how we need to, right, listen to them and get their input.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because, right, there can be a word bank of accommodations, if you will. But ultimately, if the child is not going to use the accommodation, it's just lip service, if you will. Why? I mean, I'm all about including things because they might still use them later on. And I do believe better to be safe than sorry. But for them to really understand what it is that they will need and what they will use. And at least that way, everyone, the school and the parent, can be on the same page when the child says, yeah, extra time isn't really going to help me, or I don't want to test in a separate space. Again, we have to make sure that we're including the emotional profile of the child in this. I would say some of that prep work, depending the anxiety and emotional regulation of the child, should be in the environment in which the child is most comfortable. So that's where I would want the special educator to, be interviewing and what is a safe space for that child, so that you can get the most authentic answer for what that child needs. I mean, those group meetings can be intimidating, but I'm completely with you. I think we're teaching them how to operate in a group. We're teaching them formal communication, and outside of like emotional needs that might not fit with that meeting in particular, we should be pushing to include kids in those meetings 100%.
Right. Yeah. No, and listening to them. And it's also like when talking about placement and things, where does the child want to go? Because if the child is like, I am not leaving this school, I don't care what you say, whether we have the argument to go to a non-public placement or not, why would we do that to a child?
Mm-hmm.
Let's figure out how to make it work. I mean, yes, sometimes as parents, we have to make that difficult choice of we know what the child wants, but sometimes we need to switch that to like what we feel is best. But I guess that's where you could come in also. Like when the parents think the child needs something different, you can help that communication process, right?
Right. It is. It's a lot. It feels a lot like mediation at times, right? But you're not per se negotiating in the legal sense, but you are facilitating that conversation, because at the end of the day, it's most important that everyone feels heard. I think there is a lot of different learning disabilities. Rigidity in inflexible thinking is part of the characteristic of a learning disability in many ways. But then you pile on not being heard for so long, and then you're going to get the shutdown, and you're no longer going to get the transparent answers you need for that child to be successful. So I think facilitating those conversations 100%. A lot of my work is helping sometimes parents understand this is the baseline. We cannot change the baseline where the kid is at. So we can't do a goal that's like 10 steps down the road, even though you have to acknowledge that the parent is concerned about that, right? If you're a middle school kid,
Right.
of course, you might be concerned about college readiness, for example, but we have to master like the basic independent self-help skills in order for that to even be a possibility later on. And you can't focus on 10 million things and have a good IEP, because it's overwhelming for the child. It's not possible for the teacher in the school. And so when I think the communication breaks down is like, are we coming up with emotionally based goals that aren't actually possible, and then gaining a legally binding contract where everyone feels like a failure? We don't want to set up parents to feel like a failure, kids to feel like a failure, teachers or administrators. The reality is everyone cares. I think if you step back, like everyone cares, and nobody wants to create a plan or an IEP that's like, this feels unmanageable.
Right. And it's, if you do the IEP meeting correctly, like going through and putting everything the child needs, like at the end should be, looking at the teacher, can you implement this IEP the way it's written, or what supports do you need? Unfortunately, in reality, that doesn't always happen because the teacher's not going to admit that they can't do it. But if you look at most IEPs, in reality, a general education teacher cannot fully implement that IEP. They cannot collect the data. They cannot, it's not possible. And that's like kind of where we come in, that we're failing the kids in the school system, but that's a whole nother topic. But it's, like getting the teachers to feel at least they can succeed in some ways, can succeed partially, and see the child succeed. Like what is needed to make sure this child progresses, towards the general education curriculum or whatever curriculum they're on. What supports do we put in place, and how do we communicate to that child? Because that's the other thing that I've seen, and I'm sure you've seen also, is I have a lot of pushback of kids like, I'm not stupid, I don't need special ed, because they have in their head special education is for intellectually disabled. Right.
No, and there's a huge, I was at the South by Southwest EDU conference, and I went to one of the breakout sessions, and it was like, how do we create a culture where there's less stigma? And the truth is, we don't talk about the history of disabilities enough. I've actually worked with a lot of parents. I mean, I'm even thinking my generation, like everything used to be completely separate. For special education, everything was pull out. Some of the experiences were not good. They were immensely stigmatizing. And then you have parents that have had that experience, and they have their own emotional response to even their child getting services. So understanding what that means. But I do think commonly what I have to work through is like, what is our relationship with getting help? And how are we framing that with our kids? How do we frame it with ourselves? Oftentimes, if we're an adult and we identify getting help or not knowing with shame because we feel incompetent, then we are often modeling that for the child as well. Whereas if you really look at successful people, they are people that have asked for help, said, I don't know. I think the most successful people are doing that. Tell me more. I'm not well read on that. I know I always respect people more when they're willing to be like, I'm not entirely sure. I haven't read everything. Like, you don't have to have an opinion and you don't have to know everything. And I think I do think that's why sometimes IEP meetings are intimidating, right? There's a whole lot of language. I think parents can come in sometimes and be like, I don't even want to say anything because I'm not even sure I understand the process completely.
Right.
And that goes back to, that's just another example of within that meeting, you have a teacher feeling, am I allowed to say that this isn't manageable? And then you have parents saying, yeah, that sounds fine because wait, I don't even know how this would be implemented or what this looks like. I'm just hoping for the best. And I've had that experience too, being an advocate in IEP meetings for clients. So really it just comes back to the data and like, how are we explaining things in layman's terms when we speak above people, right? All of us come in with a different level of expertise, but like, how can we use common layman's terms that are like very practical about like how things are going to get implemented? And I think that we're not doing a good enough job of like communicating the implementation. Everything feels very static and disconnected sometimes.
It's so true. And I remember, being a former special ed teacher and gen ed teacher, I was in an IEP meeting as the attorney, and the special ed, I think it was with the special ed coordinator, I'm not even sure who it was, but one of the people on the IEP team and I got into this discussion of like now I knew where I was trying to go to get from what my client wanted, and she knew what she was trying to do. And we got into this deep discussion, and then like finally we paused it a second, and I realized my client was clueless as to what was going on. And like had to take that step back because as the attorney, I'm representing the client and I need to make sure my client understands like this is what we're talking about and this is the end result we're trying to get. And then it was like, oh, okay. Which I try to set up my client, I don't want to say set up, but I have pre-meetings with my clients before any IEP meeting so that I know where they want to go. And then I always try to, when it's virtual, we can text on the side at IEP meetings. Like, if you need me to slow down or explain things, let me know. Because sometimes I slip back into that professional zone where we're in that language and in those conversations that we forget not everybody understands.
No, completely.
Yeah.
But I think
I was just going to say, even to the point of like, sometimes the speech and language pathologist doesn't even understand because we're on that special ed realm and they just know the language. You know what I mean? Like that type of stuff.
Completely. I've learned a lot from the outside specialists. I mean, I think it's important to include one thing that I really focus on is like, are we streamlining language? When you think about, I'm going back to minimal goals. If you're making 1 billion goals, I just think you're setting yourself up for failure. I know you want everything to improve, but I always say, what's the root cause that might be causing a domino effect, right? There's lots of things that play into kind of time management or lack of academic success. And so the idea is like, what's the first domino that falls and how can we target that? Which goal will impact maybe multiple things, even if we're not primarily measuring those within the IEP, we might see those effects outside of that.
That's so true. Yeah. I mean, I think about that because like you see IEPs with 8 goals, 6 goals even is pushing it. And it's like reality, they're not all getting worked on, like, and it might be some are worked on at the beginning of the year and then they transition out, but getting to the root cause, the same thing like with medication. You can give, like in the medical world, you can give medication to put the Band-Aid on things, but what's that root cause? If you don't get to that, then, okay, we solved this behavior, but then that behavior popped up.
Right.
Because the underlying might be a learning disability that's not being addressed.
Mm-hmm. I do also think a great way to start goals, especially when we talk about measuring goals and this, I mean, and not seen as like special ed and general ed as separate. I think it has to be collaborative, is starting with, let's say, for example, that the child in the IEP meeting needs to work on writing. The question we should start with before we just come out with something out of the air is, what are you currently doing to measure writing? Like, what's your current system? What's the frequency? Start from what we have. And then the teacher feels like you're building on a system they might already have, right? And maybe the student's sheet or, independent work might look slightly different if that's what's needed, or might be differentiated and slightly different. But like, what is the system we're working within? And that to me is why we need to be encompassing more of a universal design for learning, because it's impossible to be like, do this for Bobby, do this for Sue, do this for Kate. It's more like, hey, what does my whole class look like? And I have enough people that are needing math intervention or writing intervention. And so where do I start with my systems for frequency, for even just like measuring and monitoring data? And you always want to allow time outside of skills for big picture thinking, because sometimes there's discrete skills that kids struggle with that do have learning disabilities, but their strengths lie in problem solving. So we want to make sure that we're still allowing time to shine for those strengths. And so it's just a lot to fit in within the day, which like I said, important to ask the teacher what their current system is, and then start from there with manageable tweaks.
I love that, because I'm thinking there's been so many times that an IEP goal is, I'm reading the IEP goal and I'm like, how is this different from every seventh grader in your class? Like, I'm assuming every seventh grader has to edit their writing. So how is editing writing as a goal different? Like, what do we need to do different? And people are always like, oh, well, it's the supplemental aids. I'm like, no, the supplementary aids are there to support, but the goal is what specific instruction. If it was just supplementary aids, we could kind of put those as accommodations on a 504 plan. We wouldn't need an IEP. The point of the IEP is that specialized instruction. And what are we zoning in on? Is it the fact that the child's having a difficult time with inferences, or making, having the topic sentence match the body, like zone in on those specifics. And to start with, here's global of what we do in seventh grade for writing. Now let's see where his weaknesses or her weaknesses are and hone in on that. Like, I love that. Like, just, it has given me a total different way of looking at it, of helping the teacher, and that the teacher feels supported and we get buy-in from the teacher.
And I think too, again, we want to be empowering students. So I'm big on self-monitoring skills, which one, you're asking them to engage in executive functioning skills, which I think in almost every case, I honestly can't think of a kid where you're not trying to build their executive functioning skills, whether they have a formal learning disability or not. But how are they monitoring themselves? How can they come up with a system? These strategies or these systems that they come up with, then they can monitor. I used it. I didn't use it. This doesn't work. This does work. And even for a lot of it's following the directions. Am I right? So
Right.
It's how can I monitor? How can I space these out? How can I make a checklist out of these directions? Right. In some case, don't get me wrong, that might be the differentiated material that the teacher gives. That's a checklist. But ideally, in the real world, once they go off to college on their own, or they're in a career, if visually dense materials are still hard for them, they need to learn how to break that down, because the world doesn't end up accommodating. And I mean, that's one of the reasons in my business, I really focus more also on that career transition piece, because I do think we help so much. I obviously deeply believe in education and the importance of the work, but then you realize there is a little bit of a gap between this, like the strategy piece, and a lot of it being kind of handed over and very, very structured, which is great. But I'd like to see more scaffolding in those IEP goals that are empowering and allow for more self-monitoring on the student's end, because that's developmentally appropriate as they age.
Right. And it's like, I'm thinking of IEP meetings where they're like, well, they're in seventh grade, they should know how to do that. Well, yeah, but this is a seventh grader with an IEP. They don't know how to do that. We need to teach them. This is not a skill that a child with this disability is just going to gain like an atypical, a typical student. Like, we need to go in and directly teach. And that's why I like with fated support. Like, that's one of my favorite things. But when you're putting with fated support, we need to put, what does that look like? At what points is the support going to fade, right?
Right.
Yeah, because
And
I mean, yeah.
I think too, determining, right, as you said, it's like they're depending what is the gap, right? What's the gap analysis on where they are with, if this is a 7th grade objective and they're here, then how are we making sure that it's more than differentiated instruction. And that's where, right, the larger picture of like, when is pull out appropriate? When is small group appropriate? Because I think it's been interesting to watch this world change over time, whereas like we were way pendulum on the other side of like, one, we probably weren't doing the right interventions many moons ago at all. And then we pulled out for everything. And now everything is like in, but I've even talked to many kindergarten teachers, other people in special ed. And it's like, man, we could close these gaps if we could have this instructional time that's intervention based for a shorter amount of time. But it seems like something gets lost there in the system. And so I just want to, least restrictive environment for sure. And there is a huge difference between what you can do in a small group with actual intervention time as a special educator, right, without the distraction of the whole class, and what you can do in the classroom. Does that make sense? Especially when the gap is there. And we want them, the idea is IEP is like, if you do targeted instruction, then the idea is we're like exiting that goal, right? They're reading on grade level, and reading should be a huge priority.
Right. And also to consider not losing content. So like when you're pulling out to work on that reading goal or that math goal, what are they getting pulled out of? Because now they're kind of being punished for their disability, because they've now missed that classroom instruction. So they just spent a half an hour out working on their reading. Great, they're progressing in reading, but they just lost a half an hour of science and they have no clue what's going on. And now they're trying to play catch up there. So it's finding that balance of when.
Right. It should definitely match. And I think, right, you're talking about a macro system of, right, electives. And what's been interesting working in the independent school world is that can look really different. Right. It could be an elective. I mean, I could make the argument for lots of it, right? You miss out on something. We can't add an extra hour in the day. I think the goal is, I think, how do you find that balance between overall impact? So I'm just going to take reading, right? If you're behind in reading, that impacts everything you do in school as you get older. And like the weight of what we need to catch up on versus when I say, I don't want to say short-term discomfort or short-term missing out. And you do have to explain that to the student. I mean, I've had really heartfelt conversations, and I try to give choice. And I'm like, I had this earlier this year, and I know the kiddo liked French. And I said, I don't know what to do. I said, I can provide you this time. You've come to me. You've been so upset with how long homework is taking. And I want to make it easier for you because I want you to like school more. And I also understand that you like this class. So I think, again, it still goes back to voice. If you do not have buy-in from a child, you might as well forget it.
Exactly.
So have that heart feel people. I think this goes back to why I coach on leaning into hard conversations. I don't think we have honest conversations with kids enough.
Yeah.
You'll hear a lot of that. I was like, a kid comes home and is like, I'm the lowest reader in the class. Oh, I'm sure that's not true or whatever. Instead, sit there with them. Man, I'm sorry. Reading is so hard. Like, acknowledge it is okay. I think that's my other thing is like, how do we make it okay for kids to say they are struggling? Because we need to say that as adults for various reasons, events in our lives that might happen. And it is such an important mental health skill to say that you are struggling. And it's not about saying, no, that's not true. That stinks. Like, as an adult, when you're going through something and you're like, you're fine, you're resilient, right? Like, this will pass. And it's more about like, this really stinks. Like, but that's just for now, right? This whole, growth mindset versus a closed mindset, I think, is important to have when you lean into those conversations and say, this might mean we need some extra help, and that's okay. And the research shows that we can kind of close this gap, and everybody's brain works differently and everybody has their own struggle.
Right. And that's where it comes into the conversation of, and I've had this with potential clients before, is getting the services within the school the right thing for your family, or is paying for private tutoring outside? Yes, legally the school has to provide it. 100%. Yes, they do. But when you have a 7th or 8th grader that just got diagnosed with dyslexia, middle schools don't have that capacity to teach the way a dyslexic child needs to be taught. And so can we get an IEP written? Yes. Will it get implemented? Probably not. So, and that's where you have that lead into the conversation of what's best for your family and your child. Yes, it stinks to have to do tutoring at nights or on the weekends or something, but in the long run, is that the better choice? Now, don't get me wrong, like some people say, no, we're not doing tutoring at all. We're going to lean into the school and make the school. That's fine. We can go that route, but it's have that discussion with you as a family, including your child, of what works to get the buy-in, right?
This is true. And I think obviously there's a financial freedom to that. And they're right. Equity wise, like not everyone can afford private tutoring. And, I think if you can, that I would say, oh boy, I've worked many years in middle school and it's a super self-conscious time. And I think about how the majority of distraction and intentional issues that I see in middle school is because kids are constantly thinking about what other people think about them. So that is a hard time. And yeah, I think you should try to take it. It depends the school, right? How's the school system set up? What is the support staff like? Where's the flexibility within the day? How big is the group for intervention? I always say of course you should always go with whatever is free to start with and just say, really, what is the system built like? And how many minutes in it? And how many kids are in the group? And then you can kind of confer from there is like, likely what's the amount of progress they'll make in a year.
Right. And that's, and it's hard. Like, I mean, we all say it, parenting is hard. Parenting is hard when you have a typical child. When you have a neurodiverse child, it just, changes things. But I get frustrated, like, that we label the kids and their special needs and they're neurodiverse and all this other stuff, because it makes them seem that they're different in a not good way, if that makes sense. Like when my kids got evaluated, I was getting them evaluated privately. And I said to them, they're like, why do we have to do this? I'm like, we're just trying to figure out how your brain works. And if you think about it, all of our brains work differently. All of us. So you know what? Yes, a kid with autism works different, is different than a kid with ADHD is different than a neurotypical child. But two neurotypical children are different. You know what I mean?
Right. And so neurotypical people get it wrong all the time, just so we're clear, is they don't know how to adapt. It's hard for them. If we're looking, if we really zoom out, and that's like one of my passions is like marrying or like building a bridge between the neurotypical and neurodiverse world, is neurotypical people need to understand how other people think and other people's brains work differently, and they're employed and you manage them and you might be the manager who thinks differently. And so I think really the larger question at hand for society is like, how do I evaluate my own adaptive functioning? And if we could all just stop for a minute and say, not everybody thinks like me. I think that's my favorite skill that I've learned in doing this for so long is, you do so much analyzing of data and observations, and then it's important to do that with yourself. I say actually highly intellectual people, right? Exceptional people are neurodiverse in that way. And I think you have to be aware, what are your strengths, and whatever your strengths are often double-edged swords. I know it's an overused phrase, but I know for me, I've had to work really hard. My processing speed is pretty quick, but I would be a horrible communicator if I didn't slow down, if I didn't adapt to my audience. And so are you actually taking enough time to be present, or are you so caught up in what's going through your head? And you can be a phenomenal, idea creator and problem solver, but that does not make you a good leader or a good manager. And ultimately to grow and evolve, we all have different skills to kind of work on. And that's why I think everything starts with self-awareness.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, I say it all the time that I've grown the most as a parent learning how to parent my children who are both neurodiverse and both very different, and parenting for one does not work the same for the other, as we all know. And it's adjusting it all, and me taking that step back. I mean, like, I've learned how to, I still explode. I'm human. I've got a short fuse sometimes, but I explode. And then I go to my daughters and say, look, mommy, sorry, I lost it. I got very upset and I lost control and I was screaming and I shouldn't have. And I think this punishment might have been a little bit too harsh. So let's talk through what an appropriate punishment would be. And that's showing to them that I make mistakes, but I own them, which is teaching them to own their mistakes and that it's okay to make mistakes.
And that you're human. You have to remember, exactly. Kids really walk through the world thinking that adults have it completely figured out.
Right.
Like they do.
Exactly.
And you're like in your own body knowing like, oh man, I hope they don't catch on. But right. the reality is that, that is vulnerability, right? And you're modeling vulnerability by taking accountability, by saying you made a mistake, and you're showing them, hey, even when you're emotionally dysregulated, when you re-regulate, repair is so important. It's interesting. I've worked a lot with, I think, some goals around repair for different behavioral issues and how important that is. And it's hard, right? Again, like I said, I think the two hardest feelings to work with, if you're afraid of them, are vulnerability and shame. So many, so many perfectionists who also have a learning disability. It's like, I was teaching a class the other day and it was kind of heartbreaking. I've seen this situation before where they're like, I have a pile of missing assignments and I've done them all and I never turned them in.
Wow. Yeah. And why? Yeah.
The shame of looking incompetent, right? And think about how that's attached to self-advocacy. And so that whole mindset that we have to work on in terms of really recognizing when you're the person that holds yourself back and trying to create that. I find if you can create a safe environment for just that first step, and the importance of celebrating small wins, like get over the exact developmentally right thing or the grade level thing. I think I remember I try to walk parents back through, like, look at where your kid was at. Like, you guys have been doing a lot of things right. And I know this is not where you want them right in this moment, but that doesn't mean you haven't been doing a lot of things right to get here. And you have to grow and change and pivot. And, I think we don't always think as adults, like, we might not be going through the transition, but if we're a parent or a mentor and our child is transitioning, we are automatically transitioning because we have to adapt to that.
Yeah, because we have to parent differently. Exactly. It's so true. And just my brain is going all over the place and I'm trying to bring it back in again, because it's just like there's so much here to unpack, you know what I mean? And just in the reality that as parents, as the adults, as caregivers, as the teachers, help, they're not little humans, they're children that need help developing, but they also need that safe space and teach them to be vulnerable, and it's okay. Because where my brain, what triggers for me is how many times did I wait so long to do something because I was so afraid of doing it wrong and had anxiety for months, took me an hour to do it. And guess what? It was fine. Or it was not fine. And I figured out it was wrong and I corrected it. You know what I mean? Just teaching kids, it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to be wrong.
My favorite two questions to ask for that mindset are, what data do you have to support that thought? And what else might be true? The anxiety can be very debilitating. And so I think it's really important to think about what we feed. I always tell parents when a story comes home and it sounds right, if you have anxiety, right, a child walks through the day, this one thing and how they received it is huge, right? And they come in with these big feelings. And then sometimes parents will come immediately back to the school without necessarily questioning, oh, well, what else might be true? Or how do you think that the teacher interpreted that? Or, asking questions. And then they come back to the school and they're like, what happened? Then they bring those big emotions, domino effect.
Right.
And then you have to walk through and say, okay, well, what do you understand? Does your child ever is your child anxious? And have you observed at home ways in which that they might catastrophize because of their anxiety? And as soon as they're like, yeah, I was like, well, that can also happen at school. So like I said, it's the listening piece first. And I do think all that plays a role in the IEP meetings, and it is hectic because it's all timed and it's so much information. But I do think if we could somehow come together in the beginning about, hey, let's all name something that's really hard for us right now.
Yeah.
With the student there, the student can say, this is really hard. The parent can say, this is really hard. The teacher can say, this is really hard. Yeah. When do we create space for acknowledging what is hard?
Right. And acknowledging we need help. That's so true. And then I love the what else could be true, because it just reminds me of when you're going down that negative rabbit hole of what if. If you're doing the what ifs on the negative, go do, but what if on the positive? Mm-hmm. What if I fail? Okay, but what if you succeed? Mm-hmm. And somebody said once, it was, imagine how much you could do if you weren't afraid of failing. Because fear pulls us back how many times, I'm not climbing that. I'm afraid of heights. Well, if I wasn't afraid of heights, I might get up there, and you know what I mean? That's a simple, basic one, but still, imagine how much you can do. And that's teaching our kids, take that fear away from them. It's okay to fail.
Yeah. And I think too, they think they're not making a decision by not doing it. But I was like, you are making a decision. No matter what you do, you're making a choice. And there's always a consequence to every choice, right? I could turn it in and maybe it gets marked up and it's not the grade that I want, but I cannot turn it in. And then I get no growth. I get no feedback. I get an automatic, whatever, lower grade or lowered grade because it's late. There is no such thing as not making a decision.
Right. Exactly. Just like there's no such thing as trying. You either do or you don't, right? That's so true. Oh, this has been so awesome. I love these conversations that just go, and we don't know where we're going, but we'll get somewhere eventually. So for people, so what area, I know you say you all over the US and, abroad in independent schools, what areas are you virtual that you can help anybody across the United States for families, or how does that work?
Yes, for families. So I have clients, all over the US because I do my services remotely. I am local to the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia area. So occasionally, if that's needed, I'll do some in-person visits, as we imagine with traffic. I have found actually virtual visits have been more successful in getting clients on. It's just scheduling, whether or not they have a car. I also think from an anxiety perspective, it's a much more comfortable environment for them. And I haven't had trouble connecting in that way. So it's been really effective.
Yeah, no, I see that because there's transportation, you got a half an hour each way. I can block off an hour, but blocking off 2 hours is a little bit more challenging. I can see that. So you're in the DMV. And what, if somebody watching the show, if they're like, well, okay, she's a coach, but what specifically, if anybody watching the show, what triggers should they be looking for of oh yeah, you need to call and talk to me because I can help with that?
I think if you're looking for how to change outcomes, I think in that way, if you want, I'm big on equity and making things available. Some people are more do-it-yourself folks. So I have an intake package in which I meet with the young adult or the student and the parents. I'll read through the eval stuff. And then I'm let's talk through some strategies and things we've tried. Because then you get a full consultation in that way. And these are things that you can try out. And then you can kind of have ad hoc meetings if you want as things go along. And then in some cases, I'll be working with people on a weekly basis. I think it just depends on the need. And I'll give a recommendation as that goes. But I'll always, even if they just do the intake, I'll still give them ideas of hey, this is how you can create some structure at home that might support motivation and getting these tasks done. And I talk a lot about language because language is everything. How we say things deeply, deeply impacts, right? The feelings we talked about, shame, vulnerability, motivation. So I spend a lot of time on that and trying to get them to understand how we have to adapt to be effective communicators. And at least some initial goals, I think, from the young adult or child in that way.
So what I'm hearing as a parent is that if you're sitting there going, this isn't working anymore, they should pick up the phone and call you.
Yes.
Right. just that this isn't working, and you don't have to know what the solution is as a parent, because chances are we don't know what the solution is, but that's where you come in to help figure out what the solution could be and make that path.
Exactly. I think it's hard to be objective when you're part of the cycle.
Yep.
And that's natural, right? Every family has like a cycle, and and you have to break the cycle in order to create a new pathway that's more effective.
Yeah. And so how should people get in touch with you? What's the best way?
They're welcome to email me at launchpadlearningforlife@gmail.com. They can call my cell phone. I have a website where you can do a contact form there. I'm pretty easy to get in touch with and respond pretty quickly. So
great. And I know we'll have all the information in the show notes when we publish it again later. Anything else? Like, is there anything that...
I was just going to say, I have a couple events coming up. One on August 7th. That's about making transitions easier, because transitions can typically be hard. So it'll be targeted towards neurodiverse kids and parents. And so that'll be August 7th at 5:30 Eastern time. And you can get tickets on Eventbrite. And then I'll also be doing a free parent talk that is sponsored by Nora School. That's virtual as well. And that'll be October 23rd. And it'll be about parenting like a coach.
Awesome. And we'll have those links to register for those also. This has been so awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Frances. It was great.
You've been listening to Stress-Free IEP with your host, Frances Shefter. Remember, you do not need to do it all alone. You can reach Frances through shefterlaw.com, where prior episodes are also posted. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, and sharing the show with others through YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and more.